Welcome to today's tutorial. Today we're going to build a project intake form. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a form where a potential client could fill out some information about their business. And then what we're going to do is we're going to use ChatGPT as an automated quality control layer. And we're going to read their answers. We're going to look at their projected budget that they filled out on the form. We're going to decide, does this seem like a good lead or not? And if it does, then we will actually we'll have ChatGPT draft up a little follow-up email with some follow-up questions and stick that email in our drafts in Gmail so that it's ready to send and so that we can go through and do some final editing and send it off if we think it's a good client lead or not. So in this case, the demo that I'm going to be doing is imagining a website design project because my background is as a website developer. So the questions will gear towards that, but it's really the main goal of this is to understand, how do I take content in from a form, use an automation to make decisions based on it, evaluate it, create some content as a follow-up to it, and then also do things like conditional paths inside of my automations so that I can do this if this happens and do this if that happens. And so we're going to see all of those steps in real time. So let's jump into it. Let's start by taking a look at the project intake form. In this case, I'm going to use all Google apps. I'm going to use Google Forms, Google Sheets, Google Drive, really Google Gmail, just to keep it simpler because a lot of people might already have these tools. And so you might already be paying for this or have it for free. So it's a good place to start. But what's nice about these automations is as you build them out, you can actually take out one piece, replace it with another piece. So if later you build the form as part of a CRM or on your website or something like that, it's actually cool because you can swap out the form, make a few tweaks, and then you still have the rest of your automation ready to go because you're using this kind of composable approach. So this form is a little bit basic. It doesn't have really as much as we would have in a real world situation, but enough to get a demo. So we're going to ask for their name and their email. We're going to ask them to describe their business or organization so we get a little context of who they are, what they do, get a URL for their website in case we want to use a tool to, scrape their URL and show some edits. It's also, we just want to have this kind of in our spreadsheet. We ask them 3 questions to get a sense of what the project is. What are the primary goals of the website? Do you need any integrations with third-party tools or services? And do you want any custom functionality not typically found on most websites? If you're really doing a project, you might have a lot more questions. You might want a longer form to filter out leads or something like that, but this is just an example. And then this is going to feed into our conditional piece, which is, what is your budget for this project? We want to know, do they have 5,000? Do they have 50,000? More than that? So we want to just get like a rough thing. We're going to let ChatGPT tell us if we think that's a reasonable budget or not. Once they fill out the response, it gets sent to this Google Sheet. And this is all part of Google Drive. And so you can see here, I've already filled it out once and it placed it in here as a new row in our spreadsheet. And you can see I filled it out. I put a name and an email and a fake coffee shop link, and I gave some answers to questions. We'll see what happens. And then at the end, I have 3 new columns that I added to the spreadsheet. One is a projected budget. So we're going to ask ChatGPT to estimate a budget for this project, and we're going to see how that compares to the budget that they answered, which in this case, they gave us a $25,000 budget. We're going to say a projected time range, and that's basically to see like how long the project will be. We're going to use that in our follow-up email, and then we're going to have it save a copy of this draft email, and we're actually going to have it throw it in the Gmail as well, but we'll have it saved here so we can keep a record of all these leads as they come in. So we're going to jump over to Zapier. We're going to create a new Zap. So here I'm in my Zapier account. I'm going to create a new Zap. Now, when you start, you can actually tell Zapier, hey, they give you this example here. When I do this, go do this. And that's how Zaps generally work. There's this initial trigger when this happens. And then after that, a bunch of actions that you can ask it to take. And this Copilot is relatively new, but it's actually honestly pretty good. Like, it does a pretty good job of at least getting the initial steps there. We're not going to use it. We're just going to set it up manually, but that's one thing you can do. So first we need to set up our trigger, and our trigger is going to be something that happens somewhere in one of our tools. So in this case, we're actually going to connect with Google Sheets. And the reason why is we're going to wait for a new form row to get added to our spreadsheet, and that's going to be our trigger. So not when the form gets submitted in Google Forms, but when the line gets added in Google Sheets. And the reason we want to do that is mainly because then we know what the row is and we can go back to it at the end of our Zap and pop in all that information and kind of keep a good record of what happened when the Zap ran. So we're going to do Google Sheets. I'm already authenticated with an account, but if you're new to Zapier, you will be asked a number of times to authenticate with your accounts. Google in particular treats every little thing as a separate integration. So even if you've integrated with Google Sheets, but you haven't done Google Docs yet, it'll ask you the first time you do that, and so on. So just keep that in mind. It's just something we have to deal with. So we're connected to Google Sheets. We're going to look for our trigger. And what we're going to look for is new spreadsheet row. And we're basically going to say, okay, and I'm going to expand this a little bit. When a new spreadsheet row happens, start our trigger. We're going to continue. It's going to ask us to find the spreadsheet that we want. Luckily, it's right here, project intake form responses. That's the name of this spreadsheet up here. It's going to ask which tab in the sheet. We only have one tab, or one worksheet. So we have that. I'm going to continue. And then it's going to run a test. And what the test does is it's actually going to do the action. It's going to check for a new spreadsheet row. So it's really useful once you've built out your form to put in some dummy data like I did earlier, where I filled out the form one time. So you want to make sure you do that ahead of time. So you can see here it found our spreadsheet row where John Coffee fills out his local coffee shop. That's a $25,000 budget project and a couple of details specifically about what he's building. So we're going to continue, and we're going to get to use this test data throughout the rest of setting up our Zap so we can see what's going to happen in each step. So the next thing we want to do is we want to send this to ChatGPT. So we're going to select ChatGPT as our second step. And just to show you, we're now down here in our second step. Just pull this back open. We've connected to ChatGPT, and what we're going to do is we're going to start a conversation. Let's jump in and continue. I'm already authenticated, but you might have to go through the process of connecting with ChatGPT as well. So here's basically, if you've ever used ChatGPT, you send it a message, right? So this is where we're going to send in our message. And what we get to also do is pull in content from our spreadsheet row. So I'm going to copy and paste in the full message so you don't have to see me set it up real quick. So here's our message that we're going to send. We're going to say a potential client describes their business as, and we'll put in their description, and their current URL is visible at current URL. They're interested in a website that will, so we'll put in our primary goals of the website. And really what we're doing here is we're building up a conversation where we have some scaffolding text, and then we're also just filling in the values that they've added. So custom integrations and custom functionality. And then the last sentence, we give this instruction. Based on this, determine a realistic minimum budget and return just the value. So we want a minimum number just to understand they need to at least have this number in their budget for us to even consider it. And that's the first step we're going to do. And then we're also going to add a memory key. And what a memory key does is if we put the same value in this field in future conversations, we can actually keep the conversation going, and it's going to remember everything we said. So let's just say project form zap dash, and we need a unique number, right? We need, for every time this runs, we want a new conversation. We don't want it to be the same conversation as the last person who filled out the form and mess up the data. So we'll come into our spreadsheet and we'll get the spreadsheet row ID, because that'll be unique for each person who enters it. So now whenever this runs, it's going to pass this memory key. In this case, it's going to pass 2 as at the end of the string, but in the next form, it'll be 3, 4, and so on. So it'll keep those conversations consistent, but separated. And you can also go through, you can add different assistants. You can put in some more instructions and stuff, which I definitely recommend doing. We're not going to do it here, but you can say you're a project manager at a website development firm or something like that. So we're going to continue and we're going to test the step. So it's actually going to run it. So something to keep in mind when you do these test steps, when it tests the step, it really does test the step. Careful when you move into automations where you're charging people money or something like that. Like you want to make sure like this test is going to do what it's going to do. So make sure you're okay with that. So in this case, it sent it to ChatGPT. It sent all of our information. And here's our response from our assistant. And it says $5,000 is the minimum budget for this project. So it was very simple. There wasn't a lot of fancy stuff in it. $5,000 website. So we're going to publish this, or we're going to move on. Let's move this to the sidebar. We're going to add a new step. And we're going to use a tool called Paths, which is a Zapier tool that lets us move down different paths. So something to keep in mind when you use Paths. Up here, This is the step that says paths, but you can't actually like really do anything here. You click on this one, you get a sidebar, but when you click on paths, nothing really happens, and that's normal. Where you do all the work is down here in each path. This is where you tell Zapier, run this path if these conditions are true. And what that means is you might have multiple paths that are both going to run because they might both be true. You might have no paths that run. Or otherwise you want to get really specific. What we're going to do here is we're going to try to make two very opposite paths where only one or the other is going to run. We're not going to ever run them both. So let's start with our first path, and we're going to rename it, and we're going to call this the approved budget path. And we'll go over here to path B. We're going to click on the three dots and rename that one to the denied. And so we'll come back to that one. So let's start with our approved budget path. Let's click on this first path step here, and this is where we have to build in the conditions. So we only want them to be approved if their budget, right here, what is your budget for the project that they gave us, is number greater than, and we're going to press the plus and get a field from our conversation, which was the reply right here, $5,000. So only continue if the budget is greater than $5,000. Then we're going to add an or, and in our or, we'll say, or continue if their budget for their project exactly matches. And what it's going to exactly match is, let's go back to the questions, this string right here where we say more than $50,000. So if they check more than $50,000 as their budget, in that case, we just feel like they're going to be a good enough client they're worth talking to. So that number might be different. You might have a higher number, something like that. But the idea is if either one of these two things happens, if they have the max budget we're looking for, or their budget is bigger than what we think the minimum budget is going to be, then they can continue. So let's hit continue. And now it's saying your path would have continued for this test data. And that's because it's true. We were passing it a true statement. So let's jump over to the denied path, and we're basically going to do the opposite. And we're only going to deny them if their budget is a number less than, press our plus, and from our conversation, the reply. So if their budget is less than the minimum budget we have here, then we don't want to continue. And we want to make sure also that their budget text does not have, and let's copy it again, more than $50,000. Make sure they didn't answer that either. Okay, so let's say continue and test it. In this path would not have continued. So in this case, that's exactly what we wanted, because what it's saying is we filled out the conversation, we got our two numbers, and in this case, the person who filled it out, they're approved because their total maximum budget was way higher than what we think the minimum budget for the project is going to be. So you can get really complicated with these conditionals as you go along. This is just a very simplified example, but you might be pulling in multiple pieces of data. You might be checking against different databases. You might be doing other things. So this is just how you can take one response and break it into conditions. So we're going to build out these two paths next and say, okay, if they're an approved budget, what do we want to do? And if they're a denied budget, then what do we want to do? So the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to jump back to ChatGPT, and we're going to carry on our conversation. So let's check the conversation box. Let's continue. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to ask ChatGPT to estimate like a timeline for it, and we'll just put that in our spreadsheet. This is just an example of something you can do with ChatGPT. I think in the future we are going to have some tutorials about how to preload ChatGPT with a bunch of your like actual statements of work, actual proposals, actual documents from your business, maybe spreadsheets with some example data for all of this, and it'll get it to be a bit more fine-tuned and realistic. But sometimes for a lot of things that there's plenty of internet content for, it works pretty well. So estimate the number of weeks. And so the next thing we just need here is our memory key. So let's go back to our previous conversation and let's just find our memory key here. And then let's go back to this one and let's open this a little bit bigger. Put our memory key back in here. So it's going to remember the conversation. We don't have to send it all that information again. It's got it locked in its memory based on this key. And let's test out the step. And so it's going to run. and it's going to respond. And the response here says 6 weeks. Okay, so it's a 6 weeks project. I think they said it was like a $5,000 budget or something. So again, you might want to pad it with a little bit more information. So let's open up another step. ChatGPT again. We're going to continue our conversation. We're going to paste in our memory key because I have it. And in this one, we're going to ask ChatGPT to come up with 3 follow-up questions that we would want to maybe talk about them in a follow-up email. And this is a really good way where whenever you're dealing with proposals and stuff, a little personal touch that's, I read your stuff, I thought about it, I have some questions. It really makes any content more engaging because it's personalized. So our prompt will be generate 3 follow-up questions that our agency might have for this potential client and return them as a numbered list. And we have our memory key. So let's continue through here and we'll test this step as well, see what kind of a response we get. And the assistant came back with 3 questions. What specific features or sections do you envision for showcasing your products? Do you have any design preferences or examples of websites that you admire? And these are good questions that you would probably want to send. What are your main goals for lead generation? Do you have any existing content or strategies in place for that? So these are honestly really great questions. So let's close this out. And for our last step, one more ChatGPT. And you'll see the reason we're doing these as all separate requests is so that we have separate responses we can plug in where we need to go. So we're going to make another conversation and let's configure it. Let's get our memory key one more time and copy it over so we can keep that going. So I'm going to paste in our prompt, write a response to this client, let them know that we've reviewed their project and want to schedule an introduction call. Return only the body of the email and include these 3 follow-up questions. And let's paste in our questions. Now we have our memory key. Let's continue and let's test the step. Okay, and here's our response right here. Dear client's name, which we could actually populate in if we had wanted to. Thank you for sharing your business, blah, blah, blah. We appreciate your insight on a few follow-up questions, blah, blah, and a footer, which we probably don't need also. But there we go. So it's a pretty good question, a pretty good response. What's nice is it'll be a little bit unique each time. It's not super formulaic. It has those custom questions in it. We could prompt it a little bit more to maybe mention the name of their business a few times or something like that. That's something we could do by tweaking the prompt a little bit, but that's just gets us essentially what we need. So we're going to do 2 things now. First, we're going to connect Gmail as a separate app, and we're going to choose the action to create a draft. So you could have it send the email automatically. That it would work just exactly the same way. But in this case, I think we're just going to have it make a draft. That way you can have somebody sort of proof it before you send it off, just in case it's a really good lead and you don't want to lose it. Who is it to? We have the email address here. We don't need a CC or VCC. We can come up with a subject, maybe let's talk about, and then we could put in the name of the organization or something like that. Close that. Choose our default from, so it's just going to give you some email addresses that are connected to your account, and the body type. And so in here, all we really need to pop in is the result of this last conversation. So you see we have all the different conversations. We want this last one, and once we expand it, we can scroll down and we just want that reply. So it's just going to pop in that full reply. We can pick a signature, labels, attachments, all these sorts of different things. But what this is going to do is it's going to create that draft in our inbox. So when you open your Gmail, your mail app, you're going to see this draft created. So let's run a quick test, make sure it works. We didn't get any errors. So we have a new email draft in there. Let's take a look and see if it's there. Okay, and here we go. Here's our draft right here. We have the user's email address that's filled out, all that information. Sets it up, puts a draft in our Gmail, and then the last step that we're going to do, and we're actually going to do this step twice, we're going to do it here and there, is we're going to go back to our Google Sheets, and we're just going to update the information that we pulled from here and put it back in that Google Sheet, so that way we have these last few columns filled out, and we can reference this stuff later when we're planning out our projects. So in this one, we're going to, I'll search for update, we're going to update a spreadsheet row, and we're going to connect to our Google Drive. We're going to find that same spreadsheet again. We're going to find that same worksheet again. And you'll notice here they call this possible zap loop. What that means is your trigger might get triggered again by one of your actions. In this case, it's not going to, because our trigger is only for new spreadsheet rows. We don't trigger for if a spreadsheet row gets changed. If we did, you could see how this would trigger a loop, and you'd update the change and then that would trigger a new version of the Zap and so on. In this case, it's not going to be a loop, but that is something to keep in mind. So here we need to pick which row we want. And in this case, we don't want to pick the row from here because this is a static value. What we actually want to do is come over here to these three dots. And we want to pick a custom value. And that gives us the little plus icon here. And that's going to let us come back to here, open up our spreadsheet row, and pull out the row ID here. Let me close this. So you can see, so the row is pulling dynamically from that entry. So it's going to update that entry. So let's hit, go back to configure. So now if I scroll down, you'll see these are all the fields in that spreadsheet. These are all the columns. And I don't want to change anything of most of those columns, but it's those last three that I want to change. So I want to change projected budget, and I want to pull in from our very first conversation that reply. So I want that, get that saved in there so we can compare it later. That projected time range, we didn't actually use it in the email. It was just for us to get a sense this. Whoops, let's pull in number 5. And then we'll just pull in the draft email. Maybe we'd make a column for the 3 questions, but we'll just pull in the full draft email. That came from conversation number 7 right here, where we wrote in that draft email. So it's going to update the spreadsheet. It's going to update the row dynamically that came in at the beginning of the Zap. Then it's going to update these 3 fields. It's going to leave the rest of them alone. Let's hit continue. And let's test out the step, make sure it works. Okay, so it says that it's done. It actually is giving us back all of the updated rows. And if I jump over to my Google Sheets, yep, you can see here we have 3 new pieces of data. We have that full email response. We have a projected time range, a projected budget. So there's a lot more things you could do, pieces of analysis and stuff like that to populate this out. But now you have all the information stored in here for future reference. So that's just one example of how you can use integrations through tools like Google Sheets, Google Drive, Zapier to glue things together, and then ChatGPT to do some light analysis and content generation. These are fundamental tasks that you'll be able to use in all sorts of different situations, but we invite you to kind of take this process, follow along step by step if you've never done this before, and just get a sense for what it feels like to actually click through this stuff. So that way when you start making up new ideas, you'll be able to mix and match these different processes together, and your AI and automation skills will be muscle memory by the time you come up with all of your new ideas.